Thank you so much, Julie. And it's great to see so many people here. I'm very flattered and overwhelmed with the amount of you that want to learn about this culture, the Jews of Yemen, a very unique journey of a very unique people. So, firstly, as Julie gave a quick bio about myself, I am from London. I'm currently based in London, in England. And today, as we said, we'll be talking about the Jews of Yemen, going through the history of this community and talking about a little bit about this community today, and then digging into some of the cultural nuances. So as you can see here, a nice picture actually. On the right is my first cousin Dikla, and on the left is my little sister Abelia, taken, I believe this was in 1999, in some traditional Yemenite dress. My sister was the bridesmaid at Dikla's wedding. We'll be looking a little more at those sort of Yemenite cultural nuances later. But this is something that I really wanted to start with, this picture, and then to let you understand. This talk is very exciting and personal to me because I am of Yemenite descent. My mum is from there. I'll go to even the next slide. My father is from London, from the Jewish community here. And I grew up really living sort of 10 months of the year in London and 2 months of the year in a place called Yavna, which is in Israel. In Yavna, you have a lot of Yemenite people, a lot of Yemeni communities. And so my whole life, I've sort of been in the middle of this quite dichotomous pair of cultures: British, London gentleman, and Yemenite sort of fiery Yavna. And I'm sort of exactly a 50-50 mix of the two. So a little bit about what I'm doing at the moment. As Julie mentioned, I'm the Director of Program Integration at JDC, the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee. And we'll be touching upon them a little bit later as well, because funnily enough, although I work there today, they are a very instrumental player in one of the most important moments in Jewish Yemeni history. I'm also a board member for the UK Movement for Reform Judaism, and in fact, I'm the first board member of Yemeni descent in their history. I'm also the United Kingdom representative for the Schusterman ROI community, and I work as a consultant sort of on the side, doing a lot of communication, facilitation training, and a bit of London tour guiding as well, both Jewish London and everything else London, the two of which are surprisingly intertwined. So that's a little bit about myself and who you're listening to today. Yeah, I got some pictures of me doing things in various, arenas. My Jewish journey, I'm just going to touch on it very briefly. I think it's important, and why I'm so intrigued in my own Yemenite heritage, because there are a lot of people in the Jewish community here and in the States and in Israel and all over the world who come from mixed Jewish backgrounds, and some people really want and have the desire to dig into their cultural heritage, and some people don't, and that's okay too. But I in the top left is my grandma's house in Yavna. They built it themselves in the 1950s, and again, I spent a lot of my childhood there. And it's in a very like Yemenite neighborhood, less so a little bit these days. I did Jewish teen tours when I was 16, and it was interesting. My Jewish upbringing had been very much the Yemenite Jewish upbringing in Israel, as opposed to anything really in London. And at 16, I entered into this very reformed Jewish Ashkenazi world in London. That was very confusing to me because it was completely different to the Yemenite Jewish traditional world that had embodied my entire Judaism up to that point. And suddenly they were singing different tunes to prayers. There were customs that I didn't understand, words that I'd never heard of, that had never been used in my household, and I was suddenly learning a whole new Judaism. And the reason I think this is interesting is because for many people it's the other way around. The sort of dominant subculture of Ashkenazi culture and Judaism, especially in the United States and in the UK, is what most people are used to when you look at Judaism in culture, in the movies, in TV, in books. It's really the Ashkenazi Jewish culture that's being represented. And for me, that's not something I was familiar with at all till I was about 16. I was like, Woody Allen, who? What's a knedlach? These kind of things. I'd never heard of it. Chicken soup with matzo ball soup, bagels, smoked salmon. That was not part of my Jewish culture whatsoever till I was 16. I worked for my youth group when I was 22, which is top right picture. again, really trying to infuse different types of Jewish culture within that world. Bottom left, so the next thing I did between the years of 2015 and 2018 is I worked in Turkey with the Jewish community there, and I was a consultant for their community and developed learning programs for their elderly community members and for their youth. And that was a really interesting, eye-opening experience for me into the world of Sephardic Judaism. And again, I mentioned this because Yemenite Judaism is not Sephardic Judaism. They are different. And I will explain why. But often when people talk about Yemeni Jews and Yemenite Jewish culture, it's kind of boxed in with the overall sort of bubble of Sephardic culture and Sephardic Judaism. The two are very tangentially related, and we'll come to why a little bit later. I learned a lot in that sense too. So it really enabled me to dig deeper into my own Yemenite culture to try and understand how it was different, how Sephardi Judaism, Ashkenazi Judaism, and that's why I developed this fascination. The picture in the middle, I worked for an organization, Kahal, which helped young people find Jewish life wherever they traveled in the world, and I was able to integrate and learn about lots of different communities worldwide. And in the bottom right is me speaking in Berlin at a big European Jewish meeting where we had people from all sorts of different Jewish cultures and communities represented. So I've been very lucky to get a very holistic overview of Jewish culture worldwide, and yet I'm constantly drawn back to my own roots of Yemeni Judaism to understand. So let's kick on with the presentation and the real content. Now you understand why I love talking about this, who I am, and why I feel like I have a good expertise in Yemeni culture, Yemeni Jewish culture, and also how it relates to other Jewish culture around the world. And I think that's important for context. So here's a map of the world. You see Israel sort of right in the middle there. And bottom right, you see Yemen. Now, it's interesting, and I really wanted to start with this because a lot of people don't actually know where Yemen is. And that's fair enough. I would be surprised if anyone here has been there. Unfortunately, it's been in a state of civil war for nearly a decade now. Even prior to that, it was not a place that was safe for travel for anyone, really, especially Jews. We'll come to the Jews of Yemen, like of the modern era, a bit later. But that's where Yemen is, down there in the bottom right, just basically nearly touching the Horn of Africa, on the Gulf of Aden, and at the bottom of the Red Sea. As you can see, and that's notable too, that Yemen sort of ends the Red Sea that begins up in Israel, in Eilat. So that's also very notable for later on. So that is where Yemen is. A bit of a zoom in here. You can see the key cities in Yemen: Aden, Taiz, Hudaydah, Sana'a, which is the capital, Marib, and Sada. Historically, we've found Jewish communities in most of these, and again, we'll get a bit more into the detail of that. But now you have a context of where we are talking about. So that is the where. So let's take ourselves now back in time. Okay, we're going back in time to understand how did the Jews originally get to Yemen? How did this all begin? Because we've got to start there. So here's a picture of Jewish immigration and emigration and migration more generally from about the year 1000 to about the year 1600. And you see all sorts of movement all over Europe and the north of Africa, the Maghreb, even Egypt and the Ottoman Empire over on the right. And yet, this has nothing to do with Jewish Yemen. Some people think that Jews got to Yemen from Spain and Portugal. And we look, Spain and Portugal over on the left there, 1492, 1497, the Spanish Inquisition is when most of the Jews, the Sephardic Jews, were thrown out of Spain and Portugal. And basically, Sephardic Judaism spread much further, especially within the Ottoman Empire. But this isn't how the Jews got to Yemen. No, it's completely different. The Jews of Yemen were a little earlier. So how did the Jews get to Yemen? So it really starts even before the diaspora itself. In the year 463 BCE, that's before the Common Era, which we say starts at 0, in line sort of loosely with what Christians say BC, before Christ. We hear that Jews are said to have first settled in Yemen. Now, there's no very tangible evidence for that, rather than tales, anecdotal type things. And it's not till 110 BCE that we actually do have evidence of Jews in Yemen. Now, this is very notable because the majority of the diaspora, the Jewish people outside of the lands of Israel, only got there after the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE, So you've got 180 years in between that. So quite unusually, the Jewish community in Yemen started before many of the other worldwide Jewish communities by a good 150, 180 years. So this is one of, if not the oldest Jewish community in the world, continuously living in one place. That is why this is fascinating. That is why this is unique, because they have been on a journey. I say we have been on the journey because for over 2,000 years, the Jewish community in Yemen has existed in some form. We have the destruction of the Second Temple in the year 70, and you get Jewish population scattering around, especially Europe and the Roman Empire. That's when Jewish people ended up in places like Spain, Portugal, North Africa. You also have Jewish communities scattering downwards on boats down the Red Sea, ending up in places such as Yemen. So that's when the community really grew. And even more so in the year 136, there is the Bar Kokhba revolt, which maybe you have heard of. That was the big final sort of battle between Jewish communities and the Romans. And there was a lot of emigration from Judea with the Jews who were still remaining there. And a lot of them, again, traveled south to Yemen. Again, let's go back to our map. Down south from sort of the bottom of where Israel is today and the Sinai, and they were able to travel down the Red Sea and end up in Yemen. Again, this didn't happen, you know, over a course of a week or anything. There weren't sort of nice cruises back then down the Red Sea. It would have happened over the course of decades, in fact, and communities would have, you know, even gone through different generations as they went there. But you basically have three waves of Jewish arrival to Yemen. You have them in the 110 BCE. We don't know exactly how they got there, but there is evidence. In 70 CE, and with the destruction of the Second Temple, and then in 136, you had more. We get to the year 330, where we have a very unique event that occurred, very unusual to happen outside of where Israel is today in Jewish history since then, which is that, in fact, a Jewish king came to prominence in the Himyarite kingdom, and for over 200 years, or about 200 years, there was Jewish rule in the Himyarite kingdom, which was, at the time, most of where Yemen is today. And so, in fact, you had lots of people converting to Judaism in Yemen, which is how the Yemeni subculture has become so interlocked with the Jewish Yemeni subculture. The two are very, very similar, because in this era, we had lots of people who converted or especially married into Judaism because it was the dominant religion of. Fascinating, because it wasn't really the dominant religion of any other region until the state of Israel was created. So we have a very, very specific moment in time here. And this really consolidated the sort of Jewish people in Yemen and in that region, the Himyarite region, also known as the Homerite region, if you want to say what the Greeks and Romans called it. Now, after the year 525, we get to the first sort of many waves of persecution that Jews faced. The Byzantine Empire that had come in after the Romans basically decided they wanted a piece of Yemen. This had started to become a popular trade route as boats had become more popular, and they invaded and took over. A couple of hundred years later, Islam came to the forefront, and the Muslims took over that region of Arabia and Yemen. And therefore, what we see from the year 800 onwards are Jews in small, remote communities having scattered from their sort of hub in the Himyarite kingdom, Himyarite kingdom is basically Yemen of old. And from 800, you have Jews in small, remote communities all around. And there were said to be a few thousand of them, which, think about it, 1,200 years ago, that's quite a lot of people for the population of that time. So this is how we get Jews in Yemen. And from 800, the year 800, you have the sort of consolidation. To give you some context, we only really have evidence of Jews in Europe at all from the year 800. This is when Charlemagne's France allowed Jews to sort of settle and be part of the country. This is when we start having evidence of Sephardic Jewish teachings in what is now Spain and Portugal. It only really starts there in 800 in Europe. Whereas in Yemen, they'd already had like 900 years of Jewish cultural development, which means that the culture was extremely, extremely strong, extremely specific, and extremely particular to there, not really influenced by any other Jewish cultures worldwide. And so it became very much its own thing, which is why Yemeni culture, even today, is so unique, so specific, and so easy to spot. So Yemeni Jews and Judaism, this is how things started to develop. This is a little bit about the culture mixed in with the timeline, because Maimonides, the Rambam, rose to prominence in the 1100s. He was from what is now Spain, but by this point, he had become prominent across all of North Africa and the different Islamic kingdoms. And he was an advisor to the kings and sultans, especially in Egypt. And at this point, the Jewish communities, these small communities in Yemen, were being persecuted. Maimonides advocated to the people ruling these regions, of which there were many different caliphates and little mini empires, to have the Jews of Yemen more protected for their safety. And he wrote the Epistle to Yemen in 1174, advocating for the Jewish Yemeni safety within that wider Islamic empire. The Jews of Yemen were very grateful for this. And they really decided that Maimonides was the kind of person who could save them and influence them. And they really revered him as a leader. He never went to Yemen, he was never there. They revered him as a leader. And so, about 50 years later, the Jews of Yemen sent 13 questions about Jewish text and Jewish liturgy to Abraham Maimonides, one of Moshe ben Maimon, the original Maimonides' son. And Abraham Maimonides used the teaching of his father to provide answers to the Jews of Yemen, who at this point were very, very, very religious. They were very pious, and Judaism and the study of Torah was essentially their whole life. And therefore, they mostly adopted the teachings of Maimonides. And so when we do look at any crossover there is between Sephardic Judaism and Yemeni Judaism, the key thing is that the teachings and the halakha that Yemeni Jews traditionally have followed is very similar to that of what Sephardic Jews have followed, because a lot of that descends from the teaching of Maimonides as well. There are some who embrace the Zohar, the Kabbalistic teachings. Some Yemeni Jewish communities embrace that instead. And there are several rulings of Maimonides that are dissented against by Yemeni Jewish communities that are unchanged from ancient times, the times we were talking about on the previous slide. And so today, what you have in Yemeni communities is an adherence mostly to the teachings of Maimonides, but there are around 10 different elements of that which they dissent and look at the previous teachings that they came up with themselves in ancient times, which are, again, quite fascinating and highly unusual. So how did the development of Yemeni Jews in Yemen continue in this era, the medieval era? Again, trying to think about what was going on in the Jewish world during this time. There was a lot happening. We had the Spanish Inquisition in the 1490s, which spread Sephardic Jews and Sephardic Jewish communities all around Europe and further afield. You had Sephardic Jewish development in the Ottoman Empire that was based in Turkey, and you had the emergence of many Central and Northern European communities in places like Hungary. I'm going to use today's names of countries, but obviously back then it was all a little different in Europe. But places like Hungary, Germany, Austria, Ukraine, Lithuania especially, and Russia. All of this was happening in this time period with a lot of Jewish migration all around Europe and North Africa. And eventually, by the 1700s, even over to the Americas. All the while, down in Yemen, there was pretty much no migration at all. Very few Jews, if any, ever left, and very few, if any, ever arrived. And so while the Jewish cultures of Europe were getting mixed and matched a little bit, down in Yemen, there was none of that, which again is why this community remained so isolated for so long and why the culture is incomparable. It's not like any other Jewish culture. The Jews there were ultra-Orthodox in what we would call today's ultra-Orthodox, extremely religious, extremely pious. The Zaydis, who were the Islamic sect who ran and controlled the Yemen region during this time, generally didn't like Jewish people. They didn't like anyone who was different. They didn't like Christians either. And there was quite a lot of persecution. At one point, the Ottomans, the big empire in Europe based in Turkey during this time, did decide to come down and see if they could invade and utilize the spoils of Yemen and the amazing trade routes that it was part of. And during that period, just like the Jews mainly in the Ottoman Empire in Europe, there was a respite for the Jewish communities, because the Jews were generally looked after very well in the Ottoman Empire, generally speaking, because they were so integral to the trade and financial status of the empire. And so for a brief period, there was respite, but the Zaydis took Yemen back over from the Ottomans. This is in the early 1600s. And then we get to the Mausa exile of 1679, where the Sultan down in the Zaydis-controlled Yemen in that moment decided that he was very, very against Jewish community and didn't think the Jewish community of Yemen provided anything. And at this point, exiled every Jewish community in the whole country, and this is a massive country, by the way, you saw on the map earlier, to one remote region out far in the east towards where Oman is today, to be there. And this was like the most traumatic experience in like the history of Jewish Yemen. It's like the equivalent in like the mindset of Yemeni Jews to something like the Spanish Inquisition for Sephardic Jews, or even the Holocaust for Ashkenazi Jews. Now, of course, the scale was far smaller than both of those, but we have to understand this was the only scale they knew. And so the Malda exile is something that we don't even hear about or teach about or learn about, but this was a huge fracture in the moment in the trajectory of Jewish Yemen, because it sent all the Jews to one part of the country. The benefit, and the only benefit of this, was that just 1 year later, the advisors to the Sultan and the people of Sana'a, the capital, realized, wow, we've had a really, really tough year. I wonder why that is. There was famine. There was a lack of trade. There was a lack of, and I can say there was a lack of wine, which only the Jews at this point were allowed to make and gave and sold to people. And they realized the importance and how integral the Jewish communities in Yemen were to their life. And so they were brought back. And this is very, very fundamentally important, because at that moment, and prior to that moment, the Jewish communities had been scattered. Then they were all together in Malza and brought back and put in settlement communities around the periphery of big cities. And this is how the Jewish settlements around places like Sana'a, Aden, and Taiz, especially, those three were the biggest ones were. That's how they came to be. Until that point, the Jewish communities in Yemen, they weren't really like in the cities or anything. So at this point, they were kind of put into communities, which was actually helpful. So they were settled there. And at this moment, their role in society shifted a little bit as the Zaydis realized they were really helpful and integral to society. And so in sort of return for protection and safety from then on, the Jews in Yemen helped with trade. They helped with trade from the Ottoman. They helped with trade on the Silk Road. Again, we're in an era here in the 16 and 1700s where trade and the Silk Road and getting goods from Asia, especially into Europe and vice versa, was extremely, extremely lucrative. And it's basically what enabled different empires to fail or succeed. And Jews happen to be very good at this because there were Jewish communities scattered throughout. And then therefore there was trust. So this also allowed the Jews in Yemen to connect a little more with other communities. And this is especially towards the 17 and 1800s. And their role in society really shifted. And again, like I say, there was a funny kind of situation where a lot of the time they were permitted to make wine for religious rituals, and they would then give it and sell it to the higher echelons of Islamic society, who preached a specific set of rules that they didn't necessarily want to keep themselves. And that also helped the Jewish community stay a little safer. Now, there were, of course, numerous times they were persecuted, and it would depend normally on the whim of whoever was in charge. And this was the case in the Ottoman Empire, in Europe, pretty much throughout history. If the rulers were happy with Jews, then the Jews had a good time. If the rulers hated Jews, they had a bad time, and it just ebbed and flowed like that. And Yemen in this way actually was no different, really. So here's a much more zoomed in map of when we get to the 1800s, where the Jewish communities really sat. They were up in the top, sort of in the middle there, you can see Sana'a, which is the capital. The largest community was there. In the bottom, towards the left, you got Taiz, which is where my family is from, which are the second biggest community. Bottom right, you had Radha, which is where the third biggest community was. And down at the bottom, you had the Adani Jews, who are well known, but they weren't actually a particularly large community, but they were the most well-off Jewish community because they were right there on the port of the trade route. Again, if you think about where this was, it's right on the corner of the Red Sea. And in the bottom left, you can see that Gulf of Aden there. And that is an absolutely essential part of the trade route to get from Asia to Europe before you turn that corner, go up between Somalia and Yemen there and up the Red Sea towards Egypt and Israel. So again, very strategic, and this enabled the Jews of Yemen to exist and to survive, and occasionally to prosper, but often not for long periods of time. So we get now to the 1800s, and I hope that we now have a feel for this trajectory that the Jews of Yemen were taking, and where it kind of came down to. And so we have this resurgence of Jewish life in the 1800s. We have a resurgence of Jewish life based on all of the factors I've just explained, to do with trade, and a particularly sympathetic set of rulers in a row that Yemen had. You also have then, in 1882, the first emigration of Yemeni Jews. Now, this was a very notable moment because during the 1850s and 60s, it was the first time that explorers, both Jewish and non, had made their way down to Yemen and discovered the Jewish communities and told them there is a place where Jews are starting, very loosely, to congregate. And it's not that far from here. You can get a boat pretty conveniently from Aden there. And this place was, of course, at this point, it was Ottoman Mandate Palestine that would then become British Mandate Palestine and eventually become Israel. And if you think about, if people know anything about the emigration generally to Israel, it did start in Ottoman era Palestine, in the 1800s. And so the Yemeni Jews also started to trickle there. But when we say the numbers here, there weren't that many people, a few hundred here or there. Then in 1905, there was a big famine down in Yemen and in the sort of Saudi Arabia region. And at this moment, a lot of Jewish people there had heard from a few family members that there were Jews up in Yemen. So a few more went up there because the conditions in Yemen were getting tough for everyone, not just Jews. And in 1907, the Ottoman Empire, which was starting to break up at this point, just before World War I, acknowledged as a specific Jewish community the Yemeni Jews. They'd acknowledged already Ashkenazi Jews and Sephardi Jews, who both existed within the Ottoman Empire, and they acknowledged as a specific community Yemeni Jews. And this was notable as well because it empowered the Yemeni Jews in Israel to start building communities and sending word, again, back down to Yemen that people should come. So there was further emigration up until 1914, when the way emigration into that region worked changed because the Ottoman Empire collapsed and World War I occurred. So there was no real further emigration between 1914 and 1947. What you had there was about 3,000 or 4,000 Jews in British Mandate Palestine and around 50,000 Jews still in Yemen. So to give you an idea of the scale, there was a bit of emigration and there were communities that were built up, most notably in parts of the south of the new city of Tel Aviv. But still, by 47, there are around 50,000 Jews in Yemen. So we're getting much more modern era. We have a lot of evidence at this point, photographs. It's funny. You see a few photographs here. I had to dig deep into the JDC archives and do a lot of Googling to find some good photos. Life in Yemen, though, throughout the 1800s was still extremely basic. And while the Jews of Europe in Vienna, for example, you had people like Herzl and Freud, incredibly enlightened Jewish people who were composers and inventors and engineers. Jewish life in Europe was going through a cultural enlightenment in this period. The Jews of Yemen still lived very rudimentary lives. Most of them worked as blacksmiths or goldsmiths or silversmiths. Many of them were shohets, those who carried out ritual slaughter, generally having a very low status life in Yemen, but one that was largely quite safe. They were prone to waves of persecution occasionally, but again, no more so than what's happening anywhere else in the world at that moment. And this is notable for the next thing we're going to talk about. So now we get to 1948, and the most probably famous thing that people may have heard of when it comes to Jews in Yemen. So, as I said, up to 1947, we have 50,000 Jews in Yemen, around that. And we get to 1948, and of course, as we all know, the creation of the State of Israel in 1948. And in order to build a very quick Jewish majority, David Ben-Gurion ordered the Jewish agency that had just been set up to try to discover where there were substantial Jewish populations worldwide. And still at this point, there was not much contact between the Yemeni Jews and otherwise. And in fact, Ben Gurion himself wrote in his diary how shocked he was at the number of Jews that they discovered in Yemen. I don't think they had realized quite the size of the population. They thought it was much, much smaller. And it was actually, I think, the second or third largest community to be brought to Israel, other than from Iraq and potentially Morocco at this moment in time, right? So a huge community of 50,000 was taken, it was, took the leaders from Europe in Israel at this point by surprise. And so they decided, we want to bring them to Israel to help bolster the Jewish majority. And unfortunately, to be honest, to create ultimately what was going to become an underclass of people. The European Jews looked down on the Jews from Yemen. They considered them as second-class citizens. They got there to Yemen and saw these people in very rudimentary, slum-like, buildings. Whereas you think about the kind of places the Jews were living in Europe, if anyone's been to Vienna or Prague, it was two different worlds. And there was an element of superiority complex from the Ashkenazi Jews in Europe. And we have to acknowledge this because it was very fundamental to what then happened to the Yemeni Jews when they arrived in Israel. However, the Jewish agency was able to secure planes from Alaska Airlines. If you think of the two places in the world that are most different to each other, you're probably thinking Yemen and Alaska have to be up there as a potential duo of the two places most different in every possible way. But a whole handful of pilots and crew from Alaska Airlines were flown down to Israel, and then eventually having to do some very audacious airlifting. And this was all paid for by the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, who I now work for. And so it's pretty incredible and a bit full circle. I remember when I started working for the JDC in 2015, telling my relatives in Israel that this is who I was working for, and they've never heard of anything I've worked for before. They were like, "Oh yeah, we know them," sort of thing. We know the JDC. Yeah, they're the ones who airlifted us out. They're like, "You're working for them now," and that's incredible. And I'm like, "Well, it's a bit different these days." High-rise offices in New York City, rather than airlifting Jews from lands from afar into Israel. But it's pretty remarkable. And so there is an element of myself working for the JDC that feels very meaningful, quite a full circle, and definitely drove my desire to work there initially, especially feeling that I was able to go and positively impact another community other than my own, which was those of Turkey. So between 1949 and 50, Operation Magic Carpet ensued, where 95% of the Jews in Yemen were airlifted to Israel. JDC paid for it, Alaska Air provided the planes. There are some controversies here. Before we get to that, I'm going to explain Operation Magic Carpet. Why was it called this? Well, I have first-hand accounts from my grandma, I'm sadly now deceased, and one of my mum's, my mother is one of 8, of which a couple of her siblings were born in Yemen prior to the airlift. And my Savta, my grandma, used to tell us stories of how she was in Yemen as a 19-year-old, and her husband were approached in Taiz and by people that they'd never seen before. And she just called them white people, who told her that she could get to the land of milk and honey on a magic carpet. And they had heard folk tales of magic carpets in their time. Think about the concept of an aeroplane. Someone in Yemen in the 1940s, they'd never heard of such a thing. They couldn't even conceive of such a thing. We're talking about a society that's very rudimentary at this point. And so they went down to Aden, which is where all of the flights were at the south. But then she was heavily pregnant with my auntie, Zipporah, and was not allowed on the plane. So she would have been on the first flight into Israel, but she actually wasn't allowed, and therefore had to stay in Aden for a while. And something I do know is that the conditions, and this is one of the controversies, the conditions the Jews were kept in down in Aden by the JDC and by the Jewish Agency and by the Yemeni authorities, who were getting a lot of money to allow this to happen, being paid a lot of money for this to happen. The conditions were not great. My aunt was born, and they were able to board the next plane, of which some of my mother's uncles and aunts themselves had already got to Israel and had settled in a small, shanty village next to a bunch of Bedouins. There was nothing there, just desert and Bedouin tents, which later became the town of Yavne. So once they arrived in Israel, Yemeni Jews, basically one of two things tended to happen. If they managed to hold on to something precious, carpets, jewelry, silver, gold, things like that, they were able to buy small plots of land in specific areas of Israel, such as what is now today Yavne, also another town, Hadera, and a couple more dotted around the country, and build a house for themselves. If they didn't have that, which was a lot of them, so that my mother's family had that, they were able to. One of my grandpa's brothers was a carpet merchant and had enough to get enough money to buy the plots of land for them. If they weren't able to do that, they were put in marble rocks, which were essentially slums and sort of absorption camps where the conditions were really terrible. And unfortunately, as time has gone on, we've found more and more out about the marble rot and how things were. And a lot of Yemeni Jews died in those camps. And again, we have to, I'm very celebratory about the Yemeni culture. We have to also acknowledge the tough conditions and the tough times imposed by, at that point, an Ashkenazi Israeli government on them. And it's notable again when we're going to come to the status of Yemeni Jews in Israel today, because we have to understand the trajectory of this new world for the Yemeni Jews. The conditions in Aden, we talked about. The conditions in Israel and the Marble Rot were bad as well. The other controversies that is worth touching upon are the Yemeni children affair, which is still a very sort of controversial claim that over 1,000 Yemeni children were abducted from their parents and sold to Ashkenazi families. It's never been conclusively proved, but as time has gone on, more and more has come out suggesting that this did happen, potentially, you know, for a different number of people, but that something like this was going on. And also the motivations. A lot of Jews in Yemen didn't want to move to Israel. They wanted to stay, but they were told that this was the place they needed to go. Remember, they were all extremely religious. They were told this is messianic, this is the place you need to be. And most of the Jews who stayed behind, about 3,000 or so of them, were ones who were so deeply religious that they believed that they couldn't go somewhere until they themselves had proof of a messianic arrival home. And so they disputed what they were being told and stayed. So this is the trajectory. Now let's dig into a little bit of the culture, and then we'll get to where things are at today. So the part you've all been waiting for, the food. I hope nobody here is too hungry. I know for many of you in the States, it's nearly lunchtime. For those of you in Israel, it's nearly dinner time. For me, it's lucky. It's nearly tea time, nearly 5 o'clock. I'll go and make myself one of those when this is done. But yeah, Yemeni food is, so now we're going into the traditions, and then we're going to come back to finish off our timeline. So Yemeni food is something that has become very famous in Israel and throughout Jewish communities worldwide. There are really, there's more than just these 5. These are the really 5 key Yemeni foodstuffs that have become so popular because people realize they're really, really tasty. So top left, we have jahannam. That was typically made on a Friday afternoon and kept overnight so as not to break Shabbat, and then eaten on the Shabbat morning. So my whole childhood, every single Shabbat that I spent in Israel, so about 2 months of a year, I would have jahannam every single week. I absolutely loved it. Still can't find a good jahannam in England. And when you find it in an Israeli restaurant, it's decent, but it's not as good as my grandma's one, right? So you know how we all, in Ashkenazi culture, people say, oh, it's not my mother's chicken soup, my grandma's chicken soup is the best one. But for us in the Yemenite community, we say my grandma's jahannam is the best one. That's what I say. So very different. And it's sort of a bread, it's made of bread, ultimately very simple. If you think about what Yemeni people had in Yemen, they had flour, they had grain, they had eggs, and they had at points tomatoes. And that's why you have the egg, the tomato, grated tomato, and the jahannam. Very, very simple set of ingredients there. Bottom left, you have arguably even a more famous Yemeni dish, the malawa. You have very similar versions of this throughout the Arab world. Very thin, pancake-like bread. Again, often eaten with egg and a bit of salad. Today in Israel, it's undergone some real development and get really good malawa all over the place. I was really thrilled. I went to India to work with the Jewish community in Mumbai just before COVID, 2.5 years ago. And I was thrilled to see that they also had adopted things like malawa that they said were part of Indian Jewish culture. And you could see that at some point, this recipe, this idea had sort of transferred from one to the other, and they shared a lot of the sort of Yemeni foodstuffs. Then you have laho. which is a spongy, soft, again, savory Yemeni bread. Very similar, sort of descended from Ethiopian injera bread. If anyone's ever had Ethiopian food, that's the bread they eat. They're very similar. Obviously uses a bit of different ingredients, but Yemen is very close to Ethiopia. It's very stands to reason that there would be similar foods. And then you've got kubana, which is again a Shabbat morning food, more similar, more specifically eaten by Jews of Yemen from specific parts of Yemen. So my family never really had kubana as part of their meals when I was growing up with them in Israel. And on the right you have shug. Be careful with shug. It looks fresh. It looks refreshing. It is not. It is very, very spicy, made out essentially just of chili peppers, oil, and onion. Goes brilliantly with everything. But if you can't handle spice, be very careful. It's not red, but it is spicy, and there's a lot of red things. So be careful. But all five of these are essential Jewish Yemenite foods. They are not like fake, right? Nowadays in Israel, you have some like pretty hip like establishments in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem that are selling jachnin and malawach and kubaner for 100 shekel kind of thing. They've made it into something more popularized, a bit more young and hip, and that's great because it's ensuring people discover Yemenite food. But these are things that Yemenite communities eat. They're not just like fake bastardizations of it. My family still eats jachnin every single Saturday morning. Like it's a thing. We have zug at home. My mother makes zug. Friends of mine make lahoh. Personally, we don't like it as much. And yeah, we love malawach too. So these are things that people actually eat in today's Yemenite families. Even we're very contemporary as Yemenite people. Likewise, most of my family in Israel these days, they range from very religious, very traditional, to very, very modern, very contemporary, not religious at all. They still all eat this stuff. Clothing is fascinating. Women traditionally wore a tunic and something called a gargush, which is the sort of it's a type of hat that they wore, or a head covering, more like a hood in fact than a hat. That was what you saw my sister wearing in the very first picture, and you see the lady on the right here wearing, and the two ladies in the other picture. And men traditionally wore long white tunics rather than black, and a habit, which is a sudra, which is a type of Yemeni headdress, which used to be open, and they'd wear in the middle of it essentially a kippah. And this was like but it wasn't like a sort of nowadays kippah. So, but this was the substitution for what we know as a kippah. Again, words like yarmulke, I only learned that in like 2005 when I was like 16 years old. We used to call it kippah. We used Hebrew for most of these things, or sudra, because that was what my family called it. And a lot of them do. A few of my family members still dress like this. Not too many, but my grandma did, and a couple of my uncles and a few of my cousins still dress like this on the left. They're very traditional. They live in small sort of communities in Israel that are quite closed off from the rest of society, but it still exists. Although, like I say, many of them live very modern, contemporary lives in Tel Aviv and in Yavna as well, which has become a much more modern city. Marriage. You saw the picture at the very beginning. Yemeni marriage ceremonies are very, very rich in color and celebration and joy. The bride gets to wear this incredibly heavy headdress. My mother wore one for her wedding, and said sort of trying to encourage, if my sister eventually gets married, her to do it. And my sister, I think, is just worried about her neck, not being able to hold it up. Another big part of Yemenite wedding heritage is the henna ceremony, traditionally done the morning of or the day before by the women in the ceremony, where they would have henna ink, clay, and they'd put it on the hand or do nice patterns. I think the patterns did become something that are more contemporary a bit later. Traditionally, it would just be on the palm of the hand as a small mark. But this was something that women very much did and still do at Yemenite traditional weddings. Again, it's not something that's been bastardized or sort of baked. Likewise, the headdress is still used at all Yemenite weddings that I've ever been to. I've been to about 25 different Yemenite weddings of my cousins, uncles, aunts. I have a huge Yemenite family in Israel, of which I'm one of the youngest. And therefore, I have had a lot of different Yemenite wedding experience. It's always a lot of fun. So let's get back to our timeline to round us off before we can open up for a few minutes of questions. So what have the past 40 years been like in Yemen itself? So as I mentioned, most of the Jews in Yemen ended up In Israel, we had about 3,000 left. And by the 1980s, there was only 1,000 or so in mostly isolated enclaves. Something interesting that happened in the early 90s is some Satmar Hasidic rabbis came from New York, found a few of these communities, and essentially put money into building yeshiva schools and teaching them new ways of doing Judaism. They also doubled down on the belief that we cannot move to Israel until the Messiah comes, right? Which is the belief of the Satmar Hasidim. And therefore, this kind of spread around the majority of the rest of the Jews in Yemen in the 1980s, 1990s, okay? This is super notable because what this did is it started a wave of very minor, again, there's hardly any people doing this, but emigration to the UK, the US, and Argentina. Why? Because when Yemenite Jews wanted to leave, the only country that would generally take them was Israel, but they didn't want to go to Israel because they didn't believe they should, because these ultra religious Yemeni Jews influenced by the Satmar Hasidim. And my father, who is English, he is an immigration lawyer and has helped hundreds of Yemeni Jews since the 1980s come to the UK or emigrate to Argentina afterwards, because those are the only places that would take them in, claiming that life was not safe for them in Yemen. And so we have a lot of contact. We had in the 90s and the 2000s a lot of contact with the sort of remaining Yemenite community there, which is sort of a coincidence, but I think he's probably inspired by my mother. She's sitting there saying, you need to take care of my people. And it's like, well, I guess I have the expertise. Doesn't speak the language, but that's for my mum to help with. By 2007, the entire population of the Jews in Yemen was 500, and they were all in one protected compound just within Sana'a, the capital. They were there, they were protected by, at that point, the leaders in Yemen, considered to be reasonably helpful to their society, still helping with sort of basic parts of trade. However, in 2008, Yemenite Jewish man Moshe al-Nahari was attacked and murdered in a market by a Islamic religious extremist who wanted to convert him. And that really pushed further in emigration from the country. So by the start of 2014, the start of the civil war in Yemen, there were under 100 Jews still there. So some of them did go to Israel, some didn't, 100. In 2016, there was a very well publicized incident of a Torah scroll being smuggled to Israel. Unfortunately, the Israeli government at the time decided to use it as a big PR stunt in an election year, which, by the way, is now every year in Israel, I feel. And Netanyahu publicized this. And what that did is it meant that the Yemeni authorities punished the Jews still in Yemen, basically put a few of them in prison and made their life much more difficult. And until about 2014, 16-ish time, the Jews in Yemen in the compound were actually doing just fine. Didn't want to leave, didn't feel the need to leave. But unfortunately, the Israeli government's need, I should say, to publicize this as a sort of one-up over whoever, actually was harmful to the Jews of Yemen. And it was very frustrating. I remember for my parents hearing about this and my father having to deal with trying to help more Yemeni Jews leave, and they didn't want to leave. Over the last 2 or 3 years, as the situation in Yemen has gotten worse, there's a huge civil war there. The country is in abject poverty. It's an absolute humanitarian disaster, unfortunately. The Jews have gotten under more and more duress, and most of them have ended up leaving. The last sort of 70 or 80 went to the UAE last year after the Abraham Accords, and they are there. They have been offered to be taken to Israel. They don't want to go to Israel for the most part, so they're currently still in the UAE because it's close by. They can speak the language. The culture is more similar. And today, I even just checked with my dad, a couple of hours ago, just to get the final current. There are 2 families remaining in Israel. The current official count is 1 Jew, but we believe there are 2 families living in that compound together, and that's it. So we are at our final tipping point of 2,130 years of continuous Jewish life in Yemen. We're pretty much down to 0, and it remains to be seen. The 2 families are very old. There's no kids. So we're actually, unfortunately, at the end of an era here with Jews in Yemen, a lot because of the situation in the country itself. And so where does the Jewish community today mostly live? It's in Israel. On the right is the band Ewa, a trio of Yemeni sisters. As I mentioned, Yemeni Jews in Israel were initially second-class citizens, but the integration from the 1970s onwards was positive. Success, especially in music culture, helped integrate the culture into the wider Ashkenazi culture of Israel. And the resurgence of interest in the Yemeni culture from the third generation, people of my kind of age, the grandkids of the people who were airlifted in Operation Magic Carpet, we've all really wanted to rediscover our culture. And this is happening in a big way in Israel. Again, I mentioned the way that the Yemeni food scene has suddenly like blown up in the last 5 years. Likewise, the Yemeni music scene has been very rich and incredible since the 1970s and 80s. But there is this challenge of cultural preservation, and I will leave you on this, that we all have in some ways, which is how do we integrate, especially in Israel, with sort of mainstream modern Israeli culture while still maintaining our roots, our own culture, our music, our food, our clothing, the things that made Yemeni Judaism and Yemeni Jews so unique, and how to have, that have really, you know, made this journey of over 2,000 years so special. How do we maintain that in the face of modernity? And this is something that many Jewish communities around the world are dealing with and grappling with. The Yemeni Jews in Israel are no different. And so it remains to be seen. But the good news is that Yemeni Jewish culture is alive and well in Israel. And again, with this new generation of people in their sort of 20s and 30s, especially looking to rediscover Yemeni Jewish culture and really engage and embrace it, we have hopefully a really rich future of Yemeni culture, at least in Israel, if not in Yemen. And we have to take what we can, because, you know, Yemeni Judaism has been through a lot. And there we go. And I leave you with any questions. We have 6 minutes, but thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Joey. This was so fantastic, so informative. Lots of comments are coming in to that effect. We do have some questions, so I'll start to go through some of those. And folks, if you have more questions, I'm not sure we will get time to ask them all, but if you could put them in the chat. I'm going to open up the chat box now so you can simply send your chats to everyone, so we can all see the questions. And Donnie from Jewish Mallorca will help out as I ask the questions. If more come in, please keep an eye on that, and hopefully we'll.
I was just going to say, Julie, yeah, maybe we should stop the sharing the screen so we could see Joey and see yourself. And...
There we go. Okay, great.
That last picture, by the way, was me and 5 of my cousins when I was 3 years old, sitting in my grandma's yard that her and her husband, my grandpa, like built and created. So I just like throwing that in at the end.
Oh wow, love that. Okay, so first let's start off with language. What language was spoken in the Yemeni Jewish community amongst themselves and also more broadly?
Great question. Something I actually should have touched on. So. Historically, they spoke at the very beginning. They spoke in Hebrew. You know, right at the very beginning, that's what they knew. It would have been not the Hebrew we know today, nothing like modern Hebrew, but it would have been a similar language to what was spoken within other Jewish communities around Judea. After that, though, and especially in that era that I mentioned, in sort of 300 to 500 Common Era, when they ended up ruling the Himyarite kingdom, Arabic really became, or the sort of building of Arabic and Aramaic became the kind of language. And then from the moment that Islam took over within Yemen and that region, a lot of the Jews there spoke Arabic most of the time because that was the local language. And so it stopped really being Hebrew. However, they were so religious. And remember, Hebrew liturgy was a huge part of their day-to-day. A lot of them studied Torah, things like that. So the Arabic they spoke was interspersed and interlaced with Hebrew. In the same way, to be honest, Yiddish is sort of Germanic Hebrew kind of interspersed with it together. By the time you get to, say, my grandma's era, when she moved to Israel, spoke this kind of complex dialect of Arabic and Hebrew mashed together, and a sort of bit of Aramaic as well. And my cousins, who are sort of my generation, couldn't ever really understand her, but all of her kids understood her. So my mum has this like understanding of Hebrew as well, which my mum speaks fluent. She grew up in Israel, obviously, but has an understanding, sorry, of Arabic that is very minor and rooted in this kind of like a blend that my grandma used to speak.
Interesting, thank you. Someone asked if there are any specific bar or bat mitzvah traditions in the Yemeni community.
That is a great question. I don't know. I think there probably would have been. I know that the way like music and things were done, and there would have been differences in the way the liturgy was done and spoken. The tunes would have been completely different to how they're sung in Ashkenazi communities, for example. But ultimately, in terms of like actual nuances, I'm actually not sure. It's a great question. My bar mitzvah was like a Yemenite blended sort of reformed Jewish odd mishmash, which I don't think was particularly indicative of a traditional one.
Right. Someone asked about the history of coffee in Yemen. Any connection to the Jewish community there? And
minorly. I mean, Mocha is a place in Yemen that a lot of coffee beans like come from. I don't think the Jewish people had too much to do with coffee. They did have to do with like spice trades and things like that, especially in that Silk Road era. So they would have been dealing in coffee, but I'm not sure it was ever a huge part of like the culture. I know growing up, for example, we didn't do that. But Kadia says brilliant. Great grandfather owned many coffee fields in Taiz, which is exactly where my family's from as well. So there would have been elements of that for sure.
And I'll ask one more question from my list. I know that a bunch of questions just came in, so if we could, I know we're at time, but if we could take just a couple more minutes, Dani, and you could ask from those questions that came in, or Joe, if you happen to see them in the chat. To what extent were the Jews of Yemen expelled or like persecuted? I'm talking now mid 20th century, or to what extent was it just, was it a desire on the part of the Israeli government to bring them?
So the fact of the matter is they were not expelled. They were not expelled in the same way as Jews were in other countries. They were going through waves of persecution, and on the creation of the state of Israel, and especially when the war had occurred, the War of Independence in 1947, or the Nakba, whatever you want to call it, the persecution was stepped up a level in 47 and 48. So the moment to which, at which the JDC and Jewish Agency came to do the airlift was the Jews of Yemen were undergoing a very sudden persecution for a year or two. But remember, like, the Jews of Yemen wouldn't have known anything about the Holocaust or what was going on more generally. Like, they were not connected to the wider world in that way. And this is the 40s. It was hard to be connected anyway, let alone if you were down in Yemen. So the answer is they were persecuted, yes, and they were persecuted throughout the history. But at the moment they left, the persecution was particularly bad, but they were not expelled. And in fact, Yemen forbade emigration out of Yemen after that. It was like a deal to let the JDC take them, but no Jews left from like 52 onwards because they weren't allowed to. So they were not expelled.
Okay, thanks for clarifying that. Dani or Joey, did you see maybe one or two?
Yeah, there was like a couple quick ones that I wanted to throw at you, Joey. Two of them. Do Yemenite Jews pronounce the letter J? And have you visited Yemen?
I suppose it depends what dialect they're speaking in. I'm assuming you mean when they speak in Hebrew. I know that my mum's Hebrew is fairly similar to what like contemporary Hebrew would have been. So I don't know like how it would have been exactly in the past, because we don't really have recordings so much. But that's an interesting question, and one I now want to research. It hadn't occurred to me. And then the other question was
if you visited.
I've never been able to visit. I'm really upset about it. I think growing up, I'd always thought I'll just visit when I'm older, and then since like 2012 and even a bit before that, it hasn't been feasible. The people my father works with go or have been, not anymore, but until 2014, were able to visit and would bring us back videos and things like that from the streets and from the compound and things like that. So we've been able to see like insights into contemporary Jewish Yemeni life up until about 2014. But yeah, it would be my dream to go. But world politics is complicated. Finally, where in Israel is Yavne? It's about half an hour south from Tel Aviv, just inland from the coast by Ashdod. You could visit. I think it's become a more modern city in the last 15 years. They tried to modernize it a lot, but up until like the mid 2000s, it was mostly very basic accommodations and Bedouin tents and stuff like that. Yeah, until the 90s, early 2000s, and now it's quite developed and it's become this quite trendy commuter town, I think, for a lot of young couples, things like that. But that's what happened, during my lifetime, and it's unrecognizable now from what it was when I was a kid.